lot. I think I need a nap.
Number one for local news in Ottawa and the Valley. This is City News Now.
It's Wednesday, August 31st. Good morning. I'm Andrew Boyle. Right now in Ottawa and in Smiths Falls, 16 degrees. And here's what's made Ottawa City Council is this morning. It's a packed agenda, but nothing of any monetary value. Since so many of the current councillors are not reoffering, that council has the lame duck designation. Under provincial rules, council limited in its spending, as well as move people like the Auditor General or dispose of any city property valued over $50,000. Now, candidates for mayor in the October election did hold a debate on the environment. That was in Canada last night. And voters will cast their ballot board trustee coming up on October 24th. An area of Alta Vista is without power. Hydro Ottawa says this outage affects about 3,000 customers in an area that stretches from Walkley to Smythe, Featherston to Sheffield. Here's meteorologist Jill Taylor.
We still have to get through one more unsettled day and then we'll clear out late tonight. So we'll have meteorological fall, sun and cloud and cooler with a high just 18. For today, the high 20.
And in the second stories, and StatsCan released the latest report on the monthly and quarterly real GDP this morning. It shows the economy grew for a fourth consecutive quarter in footwear. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau swapping out a couple of cabinet ministers in a mini shuffle that's happening this morning.
Justin Trudeau is expected at Rideau Hall this morning for a swearing-in ceremony with Governor General Mary Simon. Press, the shuffle is coming at the request of Procurement Minister Philomena Tassi. They say the Hamilton, Ontario MP asked for family health matter. The shuffle comes 1 week before a cabinet retreat in Vancouver and 1 month before the House of Commons resumes sitting following the summer break. Emily Joveski, The Canadian Press.
City News Time 9:03. Just about a week left for Conservatives to vote for their party leadership election. Candidates focusing on the race battleground areas. Jean Charest's campaign spending resources, for example, in Ontario and BC. Now, campaign officials say they believe Charest does have the points needed for a narrow victory. That's despite the momentum behind runner Pierre Poilievre. The party says more than 350,000 mail-in ballots have been returned. Almost 700,000 ballots were initially sent out.
When the headlines say X,
he's got
no show on Rogers TV and City News.
101.1 FM and 1310 AM.
Well, last day of August. 1 day left with the risk of a thunderstorm today. So I guess we'll use September to dry off. Good morning. Welcome to the Rob Snow Show on City News. Rakesh Patel is with Inner City Health. He's the medical director, and he is on the front lines of Ottawa's drug abuse problem. Longtime columnist with the Sun Papers, wrote a column many, many years ago. That prompted a lot of discussion here in Ottawa. And sheer epidemic, it's beyond that now. It's a full-blown or a clean supply of drugs and the legalization or at least decriminalization a few minutes from now. Then our political panel, the political fix, and my gosh, there's so much to talk about with our political analysts this morning. Continued fallout from the Christian. The idea that somehow Pierre Poilievre bears some of the responsibility for, Pierre Poilievre is the clear frontrunner. Within the hour, mini cabinet shuffle for the Trudeau government happening this morning. News broke of that yesterday. It's not expected to be anything. The federal government is thinking about some kind of inflation relief program. It's one of the few governments in the Western world that hasn't offered some kind of relief to people. Come up with new measures to help people weather the storm of the worst inflation in decades. What might the Trudeau government have in mind? And we'll talk about what's happening in Quebec and in Alberta. The provincial election campaign is well underway in Quebec. Legault looks unstoppable. If anything, it's a race for second place. And in Alberta, headed for some kind of constitutional crisis, as some have warned. So that comes up after the 9:30 news. Also, events happening this morning. I mean, it's a lame duck city council with a lame duck mayor, but there is a city council meeting happening today at Rogers. Also this morning, sometime in the 10 o'clock hour, there's going to be a question period in the Ontario legislature. The big thing at Queen's Park today, third reading of bill made its way through, is that this bill uses coercion and the threat of big financial penalties if someone refuses to go. 5 addiction and the addiction strategy, needle exchange programs, supervised injection sites, a clean supply of drugs, a safe supply of drugs, and maybe someday the legalization of all drugs.
Money and shoes, all those midnight people, and go give you the blues. There's a stream that runs under the Carl Jackson Creek. You can't take all the trouble, sink them in deep. Oh, sweet mama, your daddy's goddamn Hunter Street blues. Mama, your daddy's goddamn Hunter Street blues. There for so long, above the corner store, where I made up these songs. It's my last act before I go. Oh, sweet mama, your daddy's got them Hunter Street blues. Oh, sweet mama, you got them Hunter Street blues.
Icon.
The
Rogers TV and City News.
1011 FM and 1310 AM.
Today is Overdose Awareness Day, and all this week on the Rob Snow Show, we've been looking at drug addiction, addiction treatment, harm reduction strategies. And this morning, we're joined by the medical director of Inner City Health, Dr. Rakesh Patel.
Good morning.
Yeah, thank you for the time. Very important topic to discuss with you this morning.
Not a problem. Thank you for the invitation and highlighting this important issue.
I was looking at some data. Ottawa Public Health collects a lot of data about drug abuse in the city. And the monthly numbers collected by Ottawa Public Health, 75 visits to local hospital emergency departments for opioid overdoses in Ottawa in the month of July alone. So that's more than once a day in our city. How would you describe the current situation with the opioid epidemic in Ottawa?
Rob, I don't know that it's really an opioid epidemic per se. I guess a better characterization would be a substance use epidemic. We knew it was heroin, we knew it was morphine, we knew it was not adulterated like it is today, with all kinds of things mixed in. So it's not really just an opiate problem. I would characterize it more as a substance use problem. And often we actually don't know what the patients may have overdosed on. And if it is an opioid or something related to an opioid, meaning something, some of the harm reduction things that we do, like naloxone and things like that, effective as they were with heroin and morphine, because some of these designer products listeners may have heard of, it's not that they're not responsive to naloxone. It just means that we have to use a lot more of it, and we may not have enough kits and things like that. So given the economic realities that we're facing now, I would characterize it more than just an opiate problem. I broaden that out to a substance use problem.
Okay, so we hear in the news the toxic drug, quote unquote, toxic drug supply, and you've touched on this, but maybe you can expand on for our listeners. What does that mean? Because, people may have the impression, well, they're illegal drugs. Of course, they're toxic. Drug supply mean.
Sure. So the word toxic, I guess, relative to what we've been used to in the past with, as I said, morphine and heroin, which were the common street drugs. Some of your listeners may be old enough to remember like the French Connection and things like that. For those drugs, they were relatively pure. And that's not what we're seeing today. So the supply that's available on the street, so if I wanted to buy street, I really have no idea what I'm actually getting. More importantly, I don't know what dose is actually contained in what I bought or what else is in there. So the word toxic really refers the effects from the drug beyond what people may be using it for. Let's say the youth and forget their day-to-day problems that they're struggling with. The side effects of those drugs is what leads to the term on the street. They may have to use our therapeutic engagement and diversion program at Inner City, where we try to avoid sending folks who've had overdoses to the emergency department, and we try to look after them. We're forced to send them to the emerge. So it's really, the word toxic really applies to what's happening to the user from a head-to-toe perspective relative to the purity and the simplicity of the drugs that we use. Now it's a hodgepodge of drugs that are actually out there with varying doses, varying potency, that leads to harm beyond what we're used to seeing 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when we'd see people in the hospital, people I would often get who come through the emergent. Now the lethality of it, or the harm to the person, is much, much greater than I ever remembered.
Okay. So this number, emergency departments for overdoses in the month of July alone, that's not capturing everyone who's having an overdose then. Because as you say,
not at all.
Not at all, right?
Not at all. It depends on what the data is that public health is actually capturing, and it depends on how
they describe it as opioid. They describe it as opioid overdoses.
Right.
So yeah,
and that's a broad character of an opiate. It may not. It may involve something else that looks like an opioid or causes you to have similar symptoms, but is actually not an opioid. And so where the data comes denying that people go to the emerge for overdoses, whether they're labeled as opiate or not, that's a reality. Like, do we know how many people go to the emergency department with heart attacks or strokes, or heart failure, things like that? So when you take it out of isolation, it seems like this crazy, overwhelming problem, but there's no context put into that.
Let me ask you, as people who have had overdoses, what are the lasting kind of health effects of someone who has an overdose? I mean, it sounds like, somebody overdosed, they spring back to life and they're ready to go again. I have no experience with this. So can you explain some of that to me, please?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and as you pointed out, Rob, there's a continuum, right, of somebody who's taken drug X and it happens to respond in naloxone. We rescue them, if you will, and they're able to regain they go on. And the other end of that spectrum is I see them in the ICU when I'm not at Inner City Health, and they die on a ventilator, and everything in between. And so the lingering effects are both physical, depends on the severity of the overdose and how much it's damaged, principal organs being your heart, your kidneys, and then the psychological, emotional, spiritual effects of what the experience of a drug overdose has actually done to you from that perspective. So the question really depends on what are the lingering effects from a physical health perspective and a mental health perspective. It's much easier from a physical health perspective because we have a variety of different tools, if you will, or at our disposal to manage your brain injury, your heart injury, your liver injury. What we're not so good at is the mental health aspect of trying to understand what it's actually, or how it's actually affected them. Will they have PTSD? Will they only have PTSD for one episode of lives because of what happened? And those are the things that we struggle with on the street, as it were, to manage from a long-term perspective. Part of that trust that our patients have with us may wane depending on what's happening to them. The rapport that we have with them may wane. The fact that they're not stably housed means we can't see them exactly how they're doing. We might see them today being Wednesday, and then I might not see another patient that I've seen at, Dalhousie and King Edward. I might see them today, and I may not see that person again for 7 days, 10 days, 14 days. And so even if I work very, very hard to actually have a continued treatment when many of our patients are on psychosocial determinants of health. I don't know if that answers your question directly, but it's a very complex question.
Sure. So what is your opinion on a safe supply or a so-called clean supply of drugs, Doctor?
To me, safe supply is, a principal harm reduction strategy. It harks back to the days where on the street, safe supply is essentially the same idea. It's based in harm reduction, meaning I may not be able to stop the patient from using an opiate or whatever the drug may be, alcohol, cigarettes, coffee for me this morning. But how do I help them use that? They actually can, one, regain their life, and B, help relieve their suffering. And so if I know you're using fentanyl, for example, or morphine or whatever it is you're buying from the street, and I know that what you're buying or what you've been told that you're buying. Whereas if you come to me and say, look, doc, I'm having to panhandle, I'm having to be involved in the sex trade, I'm having to resort, which I want to do, but I need to do it because of the demons in my head. And if you have an intervention like Safer Supply, so where I give you an opiate, the drug is hydromorphone, it's a derivative of, and I know that it's exactly what you tell me it is, then maybe I can use that and help regain my life with your help for physical health, mental health, drug use. So the Safer Supply allows people to have some degree of control over their system, as with the infrastructure that we have at inner city, so that we can actually provide them with the physical and mental health that they can't get to because they're afraid of sitting in the emerge for 8 hours and going into withdrawal. So they'd much rather have reliable, it's consistent, so that they can actually engage in other roles in life rather than just somebody who's afflicted by a substance use disorder. So for me, I think Safer Supply is absolutely crucial to what we do.
Okay.
I've said since the 90s, I used to be a pharmacist before I joined the dark side of medicine. And since the 90s, when I was a pharmacist, I've always said, the war on drugs doesn't work. We've tried abstinence. It may work for some people, but collectively it worked.
Okay.
And the war on drugs, as many people have commented on, far smarter than me, it's an abject failure. And so that strategy does not work. Harm reduction in a variety of different ways works. We use harm reduction in our daily lives. We know that people die in car accidents and motorcycle accidents, but we don't say you can't drive a car anymore. What we do is we create a system within which people can drive a motorcycle or car more
We have
safely.
speed limits, we have seat belts, we have airbags.
Exactly.
Sure. Yeah.
And point of view, right?
Okay.
We're not saying you can't have a drink at Tim Hortons and take it with you. What we're saying is that plastic straw is bad for the environment, so we're going to change that. You can still have, now you have to use a paper straw. That very clearly is a harm reduction strategy. So, we've used harm reduction strategies in our day-to-day lives until they're labeled as such relative to substance use.
Okay. You're down there on the front lines at Inner City Health in what you call a substance abuse epidemic. Because we've talked a lot about harm reduction, clean supply, what strategy to improve the situation, to get the number of people abusing drugs down, to get the number of, would you need, if you could snap your fingers and say, I wish I had this, and make that come true, what would that be?
If I could do that right now this morning, the first thing I would do is I would remove the word illicit from placing it before that, like alcohol, right? I can buy alcohol at the LCBO and I know it's consistent, et cetera, et cetera. It's not illegal for me to use alcohol or cigarettes or my cup of coffee here at my desk. I think that would be the most important thing. The idea in BC where they're limiting, the amount of drug you can have on your person to 2.5 grams, but limiting to a weight means that it's a drive to the bottom. So if I'm selling you drugs on the street, I'm going to do whatever I can to increase the potency, get below that 2.5 gram limit, which is kind of silly. Why not just make it not decriminalize it and not a criminal act, and therefore people can use those drugs and get engaged in the healthcare system, so that, again, as a perspective, we can help you manage a substance use disorder. We can help you regain your life and all the roles that you need to play in your life, and to relieve the suffering you're going through, both from a physical health point of view and a mental. First thing I would advocate is let's legalize drugs and forget this war on drugs. It's been an abysmal failure. The second thing I would do or recommend, which lots of different organizations across the city are, work on the psychosocial determinants of health. You know, people need security of housing. They need food security. There's lots of issues now with food banks, as you, I'm sure, know about and talked about. Security of life skills, job skills, so that people don't have to live on the street because they don't have any other options. So I think if they had secure, subsidized how we're doing it inner city health, now there's stability for that person, and we can see them actually regularly rather than once every week or 2 weeks or a month kind of thing, and we have no idea where they've gone to because living in an encampment, et cetera, et cetera. And the which is what Dr. Hatch, who is our psychiatrist at Inner City Health, and his access to community mental health will get through the mental health disorders that, you know, we're just not good at managing. We just don't put in the same infrastructure. And if you don't believe me, or if your readers, or your listeners don't believe me, just walk into any cancer treatment center in the city, and then walk to the psychiatry ward in the city, and look at the difference. Very clearly is going to tell you where we as a society have decided where we're going to put our healthcare resources. Nobody wants to be against cancer. But very few people are for mental health services. And we need to change that paradigm, right? Lots of hospitals have this great big walls that say, hey, help us cure cancer in your lifetime, donate to, our foundation.
Sure.
Which is a bit of a disingenuous statement, because first of all, cancer is not a disease, and we can't even cure diabetes. How are we going to cure cancer? And so the way we channel, if you will, people's charity into cancer and more sort of high-profile disease, I think that framework needs to change, where mental health has the same footing as cancer, quote unquote. And I think that will add to changing our mindset and the framework of how we look after people, because mental health, it's not like a broken bone. You can fix a broken bone. Fixing the brain takes a lot more resources and time.
Yeah. Think about, Doctor. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And if you're listening to them and, help support what we do, work with us. You don't have to be cured everything. I don't think we're going to find a cure. And asking why we have a safe injection site, I would recommend your listeners ask the question, what can I learn people who need to use a safe injection site so that they become my neighbors, good neighbors, instead of somebody I have to fear or worry about.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor, again. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
news in Ottawa and the Valley. City News now on 101.1 FM and 1310 AM.
It's Wednesday, August 31st. Good morning. I'm Andrew. 16 degrees in Smiths Falls, 16 as well. And here's what's making news this hour. 3 separate outages in the east end of Alta Vista this morning. Crews are working to get your power back. About 3,000 customers are affected. This area stretches from Smythe to Walkley, from Sheffield to Featherston. Hydro is working to have all that power restored by about 11:30 this morning. A somewhat handcuffed city council meeting since it was declared lame duck according to provincial rules. The power for major spending and any staff personnel changes. Now, because so many current councillors decided not to run in the fall, this municipal election, there is still a number of items on the agenda, big money issues at City Council today. People throughout the Outaouais should find out where the party leaders in the provincial election there stand on gun control. An advocacy group that includes survivors' families of the 89 École Polytechnique shooting in Montreal sent a questionnaire to the party leaders this week. Survivor and gun control advocate Natalie Provost says the group aims to provide voters with a Quebec fall on issues like the handgun ban or a gun buyback program. City News Time, 9:36. Follow up online at ottawa.citynews.ca.
Strong voice.
Strong opinions.
Rob Snow Show returns on Rogers TV and City News.
Strategy Corps. Good morning, Garry.
Good morning.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm great. It's nice to hear from you. And Bryan.
With you?
And Bryan Decthou. Isn't that name right? Decthou?
You are correct, yes.
Excellent. Is a consultant with Crestview Strategy. And good morning to you.
Good morning.
Really want to start with dominating the federal political discussion this week, and that's what happened to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, while she was in Grand Prairie, Alberta, the City Hall in Grand Prairie, Alberta. Remind everyone what it sounded like when she was waiting for an elevator and then getting into an elevator, and she was accosted by a very angry man. And let's listen to this.
Elliot, great, that's Christina.
What are you doing in Alberta? You get this province.
You don't belong here.
To be blunt. And sadly, there are a number of those people who are out there and think that they have the right to just accost people in public, especially elected officials. It's wrong, and it should be called out, no matter who it happens to, no matter what the political stripe. And, you know, I saw the longer video where this guy was spoiling for a fight.
Yeah.
You know, he said he went out in the parking lot and said, "Oh, I can't believe we found her. Oh, yeah. Oh, I was so hyped
all
up."
Proud of himself, right?
He was all proud of himself and all hyped up on his own testosterone there. You know, it was disgraceful. It was awful, and we should call it out for what it is. It was a verbal attack on somebody, and you know, for the finance minister to have to cower an elevator to get away from this guy. You know, and this was also in like Grand Prairie City Hall.
In the City Hall, yeah.
Where this guy just seemed to be able to wander in at will. And he was rude to the other staff. He was accosting them. So, you know, I think it was just, this guy was spoiling for a fight. And there are people from all political stripes out there who are like that, who think it's their God-given right to just go out and verbally assault people.
Okay. Bryan, when you saw the video, what went through your mind when you saw the video?
I mean, I share all the same feelings that were just expressed. I would add, I feel for Chrystia Freeland. I also feel for the young women that were also in that elevator. You know, these young staffers who also had to face the anger of that individual, and those can be scary scenes. You know, that situation could have definitely escalated, and it's pretty sad to see anyone, and certainly our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of of Finance in that situation. I would say that this type of anger is not unique to Canada. It's been brewing for years. We've seen people storm Capitol Hill in the U.S. We've seen Ottawa get occupied for weeks. We've seen the Prime Minister get rocks thrown at him on the campaign trail. And, we've seen this level of vitriol online, and it has grown over the years. But the number of individuals that have been emboldened to act on said anger is what is deeply concerning.
Okay, let me ask you another kind of angle to this. There's a moment there where I described it earlier in the week as she's trapped in the elevator, and all she can do is wait for the door to close, her and the people around her. And it must have been terribly, I would call it frightening. He's a rather large man. This other woman is there, and they're just unloading on her. It's a verbal thing, but what if it wasn't, right? That's what I was thinking. Shouldn't someone, today it's Chrystia Freeland who's the Deputy Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, but shouldn't anyone of that stature in that position have a full-time security detail? What do you think, Garry?
Well, cabinet ministers already do have access to security details, but it's only when a threat has been
identified or something.
Identified. I know of several examples when I was a political staffer in the Harper government, where we had cabinet ministers who all of a sudden there was a large, obviously armed gentleman following them around, where the week before there hadn't been an obviously armed, a large gentleman following them around, and it's because they had received a death threat that was deemed to be viable or credible, or things of that nature. I remember very much Jim Flaherty had a very, very large security detail for a while after the income trust decision that he made, and I think somebody actually went to jail over that. But I think this is a debate which is only going to increase the level of security, not just for cabinet ministers, but for, your rank and file member of parliament. We know that members of parliament's offices are often, very close to the public. They're in either, shopping plazas or an office tower next to the doctor's office and the optometrist. And, increasingly those offices have been closed off with security, but, it still would not prevent anybody from, walking into those offices if they had, ill intent in a lot of cases. So this debate is only going to increase, and I think it's appropriate to have that debate about the level of security. The flip side to that too is, as Canadians and speaking with people who are elected officials, they like the ability of being in that small town world where they can go about for the most part, go about their day or their private life, anonymously, or people leave them alone. The question is, are we changing as a society?
Yeah, well, I think maybe it's kind of a new threat environment, I would say. It seems to be a new threat environment, I would say. But Bryan, let me hear from Bryan on this. Bryan, what do you think?
I agree. I think there's something nice about our elected officials being so accessible. There's something great about jumping on an airplane and being seated beside a minister on business class. There's something nice about running into a minister, an MP near Parliament Hill and being able to approach them. I think that is something that is uniquely Canadian, because that is not the case in many other countries where everyone seems to have a motorcade and security detail and no one is accessible. So I think that's something that is particular about Canada, that it can be difficult to let go, but the landscape has changed. There are new threats. If we go back to the video that we heard earlier in this segment, Chrystia Freeland's first reaction to someone yelling her name in, I would say, a pretty loud and rude way, is to be engaging. She actually says, yes, she answers before realizing that there was potential for escalation and fleeing to the elevator and realizing that she was trapped in there and just waiting for those doors to close. So that's a situation where this issue definitely needs to be revisited, because we shouldn't have to wait until something truly dangerous happens before we act. We've seen in other countries, for example, in the UK, MPs that have been shot, stabbed. That is something that is terrible. It's something that we do not want here in Canada, and we should not have to wait until a situation gets to that point before we start changing certain measures.
Okay, one more thing. Pierre Poilievre was asked during one of his stops on the West Coast about this. This intimidating behavior by some Canadians against politicians, and this is what Pierre Poilievre had to say.
Well, it's absolutely unacceptable, and I can relate, of course, because I've been the subject of so much online harassment and abuse. My wife has received so much horrific material directly to her social media account that we've had to hire a private security firm to protect our family against all of that abuse. So unfortunately, this is all too common and all too long-standing. We have to put an end to it and demand that everybody treat other Canadians with respect when we debate political ideas.
Okay, so some people are circling back, and they're trying to pin this on Poilievre and the tone of his campaign. What do you think about that? Anything to that? Garry Kellar?
I think that's an outrageous accusation. I think there's nothing in common. I think Mr. Poilievre has obviously condemned the comments and said that he himself makes those comments. And neither Chrystia Freeland nor Pierre Poilievre are alone in that. I've also worked in an office where that has happened. That is, I think that accusation is beyond the pale for a lot of people to make that accusation.
Okay, Bryan.
What disappointed me about Pierre Poilievre's answer is that he made it about himself, and at no point in the video does he mention Chrystia Freeland by name or really refers to that incident. He mostly mentions or talks about himself and the abuse that he and his wife have received. And I'm not saying that that's not the case. There are definitely issues on all sides of the political spectrum, but I do somewhat agree that Pierre Poilievre's campaign and the tone of it can be seen to have fanned the flame or added fuel to the fire.
No, I'm gonna disagree with that vehemently. The guy showed up at a Pierre Poilievre campaign. He was a great AA-hole, as I said. He tried to insert himself to try to approach Pierre Poilievre. He was pulled aside. Fortunately, because there was enough people around at that Poilievre event, there could be people that pulled that guy aside and de-escalated him, escorted him away from Pierre Poilievre. But that guy could have gone just as up in Pierre Poilievre's grill. It was only fortunate that he was in a very public place with a lot of people that situation was de-escalated.
Okay.
And I think to start asking
it's not just blame on this
is wrong. It's absolutely wrong.
Bryan?
It's not just that guy. I think that if we just look at the occupation of Ottawa, there were many similar events. There were many MPs that were accosted on or near the Hill. There were many Canadian citizens that were accosted on the Hill, and these are actions that Pierre Poilievre have yet to condemn. So
no, he did condemn those. He said very clearly that he did not support the comments of people who were threatening or inciting violence. He said that very, very clearly. What he did say was that those people that were engaged in peaceful protest, he had no problem with people engaging in peaceful protest, but he did actually say that those people who were, aggressive or breaking the law, he condemned those people.
Okay, let's move along, because there's a lot of other things to get to here. I want to fast forward to the Quebec Election campaign. There's a developing story here. I find this really interesting. Radio Canada, so French CBC. This is Thomas Sherbet, is a correspondent with CBC Radio Canada. And according to three sources, the Legault government is still open to the LNG Quebec project. This was Energy Saguenay. The company pulled out after the rail blockage just before the pandemic. Economy Minister Pierre Fitzgibbon's office reportedly let Ottawa know that after the election, the CAQ would like to reconsider and accelerate the project. That's a huge liquefied natural gas project that would end in the Saguenay region. Big upgrades to the port in Saguenay. The pipeline was already under construction. It was more than $7 billion, that project. And I thought it was dead, over, done, stick a fork in it. Bryan, you're really familiar with what's going on the ground there. What's your reaction to that, Bryan? Are you surprised to hear that? Or?
It is somewhat surprising, but when you have a CAQ government that is likely going to not only get back into power, but likely with an overwhelming majority, you have François Legault with the wind underneath his sails. He can do almost whatever he wants, and what we've seen is that his popularity has meant that he rarely faces a strong opposition from the feds. We saw that in the dynamics of the fall 2021 federal election, where the federal government were, somewhat scared of opposing the things that François Legault was proposing. At the time, that was Bill 96. So François Legault is well aware of the power that he has, the clout that he has, and this is also going to be a big electoral issue for some regions in Quebec, notably the Saguenay. I guess it shouldn't be that big of a surprise to see.
I wonder what kind of reception it will get from Trudeau. I mean, the German chancellor came wanting Canada's natural gas, and Trudeau offered him an imaginary hydrogen plant from Newfoundland. So, Garry, what do you think, Garry?
I think it's a fascinating development in the Quebec election, which at this point has obviously been a little bit quiet. And we know Minister Fitzgibbon is probably one of the more right-of-center, pro-economic ministers within the Quebec government. So that's certainly interesting. We also know that Quebec brought forward this Bill 21, to prohibit hydrocarbon development in the province of Quebec. But the important thing to recognize is that was before Russia invaded Ukraine, and the debate has completely changed. There was also a very interesting interview with the finance minister of Quebec, who basically said that very same thing. The world has changed. If Germany needs access to LNG, let's have that conversation, because if they're getting it from Canada, or they're getting it from, if Germany's getting it from somewhere else, and the emissions are greater in the transportation of that than it is from Canada, well, then getting it from Canada is a better thing. And like I say, the world and the geopolitical situation has changed dramatically, and now people are starting to say, there is an opportunity here. Again, should make for an interesting campaign, because most of the parties in the rest of the campaign in Quebec are aligned to the left of the Legault government, with only...
Quebec Solidaire is running totally on an environmental platform.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's
like a $26 billion plan for the environment. So anyway, I find that to be a really interesting development.
Absolutely.
Kind of came out of nowhere this morning in a tweet from a reporter from Radio Canada. But in addition to that, just maybe you can give me some other thoughts, Bryan, on how Legault finds his party in this position where it's poised to just crush all challengers in this election. What makes Legault so appealing to Quebecers?
A good question. Yeah, I would say François Legault's popularity is part of a broader realignment in Quebec politics, away from some of the old separatism versus federalism paradigm to a more pragmatic nationalism. And Legault has been the embodiment of that. His unique mix of cultural nationalism, political populism, and economic pragmatism has strongly resonated with Quebec voters, and that's why he's so popular. And the left have, or the other parties, the opposition, have struggled to connect with Quebec voters. And perhaps I should add that the pandemic hasn't helped in any jurisdiction. The pandemic was not great for opposition parties because it was very difficult for them to get airtime, to get their message out, or to actually do their duty of opposing government. So it makes for a very interesting campaign, even though we all know who will win, and this is turning into a race for second place. There are still many dynamics that are quite interesting. I mean, for the last 50 years, the province has essentially been run by two parties, the Parti Québécois and the Quebec Liberals, and both may not be relevant by October 3rd.
Yeah, I mean, Garry, the two parties that we grew up with, Garry, the PQ and the Liberals, could be decimated after this election. Crazy.
The shocking thing is the growth of the parties, both the CAQ and Quebec Solidaire and the Conservative Party. These are all parties that were formed for the most part after the year 2000. So this is quite a realignment in Quebec politics. And Francois Legault's campaign reminds me a little bit of Doug Ford's campaign. He's kind of the everyman of Quebec politics. Obviously, the situation is a little bit different, but think back to the pandemic. Quebec had some horrific stories about long-term care facilities and the number of deaths that skyrocketed under the Legault and the CAQ, and it seems to be ancient history for a lot of voters. And Legault brings stability combined with that flavor of nationalism without going as far as the PQ's view on separatism. So he's attractive to a lot of different voters from a lot of different voting coalitions. But the question for me is, will he have moved his party from an electoral standpoint platform too far left where he leaves his right flank exposed for Duhem and the Conservatives? I don't know at this point. I think it's too early to tell. But, there were some indications that his plan was to move left to absorb as much of that vote as possible. We'll see if he's left his right flank.
I think just as many people are wondering if Duhem has moved this Conservative Party too far to the right, Garry. So
that's a fair question, too.
Okay. All right. We got to run out of time. Very busy this morning. Hey, thanks for the conversation. We'll speak soon.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, bye-bye. Garry Kellar, Vice President of Strategy Corp, and Bryan Decthou, Consultant at Crestview Strategy. Talkback hour next on The Rob Snow Show on City News.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV.